The night didn't scream tragedy. It whispered it. That's the unsettling part. Because when neighbors later replayed the timeline in their heads, nothing about that Saturday evening suggested it would end in blood. No raised voices echoing down the street. No frantic calls to emergency services. No flashing lights. Just a quiet, upscale neighborhood settling into the calm rhythm of a holiday weekend. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And yet, by sunrise, 2 lives were gone, slaughtered behind closed doors. So let me ask you something right now, before we go any further. How well do you really know the people you think you understand? Because tonight's story isn't just about violence. It's about masks. It's about legacy. And it's about the kind of family secrets that don't stay buried forever. In the early hours of a Sunday morning, authorities would later say, something went horribly wrong inside a sprawling hillside home owned by one of Hollywood's most recognizable power couples. A man whose name was synonymous with decades of influence. A woman admired for her quiet strength behind the scenes. Together, they were considered untouchable, respected, envied, until they weren't. What makes this case so disturbing isn't just how it ended. It's how normal everything seemed right up until it did. Hours before their deaths, the couple had been smiling for photos, laughing, mingling, raising glasses at an exclusive holiday party thrown by one of late-night television's most beloved figures. Friends would later describe them as relaxed, happy even. No visible tension, no hint of what was about to unfold. But here's where the story fractures. Because behind those smiles was a pressure cooker that had been building for years. And by dawn, it finally exploded. The first official call came in just after 9 a.m. Not from a neighbor, not from security, but from inside the family itself. Their adult daughter, arriving for what she believed would be a casual Sunday visit, pushed open the front door and walked into a scene no child should ever see. Blood, silence, and the horrifying realization that nothing could be undone. Later, investigators would describe the injuries in clinical language. Multiple sharp force wounds, deep lacerations, evidence of a struggle, the kind of details that strip humanity down to cold terminology. But what the report couldn't explain was the why. Why would 2 people with wealth, status, and decades of success meet such a violent end in their own home? And why, as detectives dug deeper, did the timeline begin to raise more questions than answers? The deaths were quickly ruled a homicide. That much was clear. What wasn't clear was who had crossed the threshold between anger and annihilation. At first, suspicion fell where it always does. A break-in, a robbery gone wrong, an outsider who slipped through the gates under cover of darkness. It was comforting to believe the danger came from outside. It always is. But then the evidence started to whisper a different story. No forced entry, no ransacked rooms, nothing missing. The house hadn't been invaded. It had been entered by someone welcome. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began reconstructing the couple's final hours. The party, the drive home, the lights going off, the last text messages sent, the unanswered calls that followed. And then came the detail that shifted everything. In the days after the murders, a lifelong family friend stepped forward with information that had never been publicly discussed. Information that painted the final evening in a very different light. According to this source, the night didn't end with laughter and champagne. It ended with shouting. An explosive confrontation between the couple and their adult son, Nick. A confrontation so heated that guests at the party would later recall tension simmering beneath the surface. A stiffness in body language. A quick departure that felt rushed. Wrong. At the time, no one thought much of it. Families argue. Especially powerful ones. Especially during the holidays. Especially when old wounds resurface. But now, with 2 bodies and no clear suspect, that argument took on a chilling significance. What was said that night? What line was crossed? And why had no one talked about it until now? Friends described the son as brilliant but troubled, charismatic in public, volatile in private, a man who had lived his entire life under the crushing weight of expectation. Born into privilege, yes, but also into comparison, into shadows cast by a towering legacy. Imagine growing up knowing that no matter what you accomplished, it would never be enough. That your last name opened doors, but also locked you into an identity you didn't choose. Some thrive under that pressure. Others fracture. As investigators peeled back layers of the family dynamic, a pattern began to emerge. Years of unresolved conflict, financial disagreements, creative control battles, accusations of betrayal that cut deeper because they came from blood. This wasn't a family that fought loudly in public. They fought quietly, and those are often the most dangerous kinds of fights. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual that night. No screams, no crash, just the faint hum of the city below the hills, which led investigators to a chilling possibility. What if the violence wasn't chaotic? What if it was deliberate? Autopsy findings suggested precision. Not rage alone, but intent. The kind of wounds that speak to proximity, to familiarity, to someone who didn't hesitate, someone who knew exactly where to strike. And yet, no arrests were made. Not immediately. Because here's the truth no one wants to admit. In cases like this, the hardest suspect to confront is the one closest to the victims, especially when reputation, influence, and optics collide. The media descended quickly. Headlines screamed speculation. Pundits argued. Online forums erupted with theories ranging from professional hit jobs to jealous rivals. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone thought they saw the answer. But the evidence didn't support a stranger. It pointed inward. And that's where things got uncomfortable. Phone records revealed multiple unanswered calls between family members in the early hours of the morning. Messages sent but never replied to. Gaps in the timeline that no one could explain. Then came the security footage. Or rather, the lack of it. Cameras that should have been recording mysteriously stopped working for a window of time that aligned almost perfectly with the estimated time of death. Technicians were baffled. Malfunction? Tampering? Coincidence? How many coincidences does it take before the word loses meaning? As days turned into weeks, pressure mounted on investigators. The public wanted answers. The industry wanted silence. And the family wanted privacy. Those three things rarely coexist. Behind closed doors, detectives revisited the argument at the party. They tracked down guests, compared stories, noted inconsistencies. Some remembered raised voices. Others remembered nothing at all. Selective memory has a way of protecting people, especially powerful ones. And yet, one detail refused to fade. The couple had left the party early, much earlier than expected. No goodbyes, no explanations. They went home, and something followed them. Something that had been building long before that night. What happened after the front door closed is still being pieced together. But one thing is certain. Whatever exploded inside that house wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. And as the investigation edged closer to the truth, one question loomed larger than all the others. Was this a crime of passion, or the final act of a family war that had been raging for decades? Because what came next would force everyone involved to confront a reality far darker than anyone was prepared for. And once that door opened, there would be no closing it again. The thing about endings is that they rarely announce themselves. They don't crash through the door with warning sirens and flashing lights. They arrive quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as just another night. Saturday evening began like countless others before it. Warm lights, valets lining the curb, laughter spilling from the open doors of an exclusive home perched high above the city. From the outside, it looked like celebration. Success. The kind of gathering people later brag about attending. Inside, the air hummed with money, influence, and history. This was not just a holiday party. It was a checkpoint. A ritual of belonging in a town where access is everything and absence is noticed. And Rob and Michelle were there. They arrived together, as they always did. Side by side. Comfortable. Familiar. The kind of couple people assumed had figured life out decades ago. He shook hands. She smiled politely. The room bent toward them without anyone meaning it to. You could feel it. The gravity. Guests later said Rob seemed lighter than usual that night. Relaxed. Animated. He told stories. He laughed loudly. The kind of laugh that fills space and signals confidence. Michelle stayed close, her hand occasionally brushing his arm. A small gesture, but one people remembered. Because later, they would question everything. Nick arrived separately. That alone raised eyebrows, though no one said it out loud. Families like theirs learned long ago how to keep discomfort invisible. Appearances mattered. Especially here. Nick moved through the room differently. Faster. Sharper. Less interested in small talk. He nodded at familiar faces, but didn't linger. He drank quickly. Too quickly, some thought. Was he nervous? Angry? Distracted? Or was this just who he had become? Friends described him as magnetic in short bursts, brilliant in conversation, exhausting over time, a man who burned hot and left scorch marks whether he meant to or not. And tonight, something about him felt off. The first sign came near the bar. A producer, a longtime acquaintance of the family, overheard raised voices. Not shouting. Not yet. Just tension. The kind that snaps words tight and turns jokes into weapons. Nick leaned in toward his father. Rob's smile stiffened. Michelle's eyes flicked between them, alert now. Watchful. The conversation ended abruptly. They separated. People noticed. But again, no one intervened. This was Hollywood. Family drama was background noise. Everyone assumed it would blow over. It always had before. But tension doesn't dissipate when ignored. It ferments. As the night went on, witnesses recalled small moments that only made sense in hindsight. Rob checking his phone repeatedly. Michelle retreating to a quieter corner. Nick disappearing outside for long stretches, pacing near the driveway. One guest remembered Michelle asking a pointed question. "Have you talked to him?" Rob reportedly sighed before answering. That sigh would later haunt her. By the time dessert was served, the fracture was obvious. The family was no longer performing unity. They were managing fallout. And then, without ceremony, Rob and Michelle left. No goodbyes. No lingering hugs. Just a quick exit that caught even the host off guard. The car pulled away into the dark hills, carrying with it more than just two passengers. Back at the house, the mood had shifted. The drive home was quiet at first. Streetlights streaked across the windshield. The city below glittered, oblivious. Michelle finally broke the silence. "What was that?" Rob didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low, controlled, dangerous in its restraint. He crossed a line. That phrase echoed later in police interviews. Crossed a line. But no one ever agreed on which one. They pulled into the driveway just before midnight. The house loomed ahead of them, all glass and angles. A fortress disguised as art. Inside, the tension snapped. What began as a conversation turned into an argument. Voices rose. Accusations surfaced. Years of grievances spilled out with no filter left to contain them. You don't fight about one thing when the real issue is decades old. Nick arrived shortly after. No one knows exactly how the conversation restarted, but investigators believe the argument resumed almost immediately. Louder now. More volatile. Neighbors later said they heard nothing, which suggests something chilling. The shouting likely stopped quickly, not because peace was made, but because something more decisive took over. The autopsy would later show no hesitation wounds, no defensive cuts on the victim's hands. That detail alone changed how detectives viewed the scene. This wasn't chaos. It was control. At some point in the early hours of Sunday morning, the house went silent. Lights turned off. Phones stopped pinging. The city kept breathing. Inside, time froze. Hours passed. Morning came. And that's when Romy arrived. She had texted earlier. No response. That wasn't unusual. Her parents slept in on Sundays. But something nagged at her. A feeling she couldn't shake. She used her key. The door opened easily. The quiet inside was wrong. Heavy. Pressurized. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. She called out. No answer. She took a few steps forward. And then she saw it. The scene would later be described in sanitized language. Investigators always do that. It helps them cope. It distances them from the human cost. But there is no language that softens what she walked into. Blood where blood should never be. Stillness where life had been. Her scream broke the silence that had lasted for hours. Police arrived quickly. So did the press. And just like that, the private imploded into the public. At first, authorities spoke carefully. An ongoing investigation. No suspects named. No details released. But inside the department, the questions were already multiplying. Why were there no signs of forced entry? Why were valuables untouched? Why did the timeline place family members at the center of the final hours? And most unsettling of all, why did every road seem to lead back to one unresolved confrontation at a party no one thought mattered? As detectives began pulling phone records, witness statements, and security logs, a pattern emerged that refused to stay buried. This wasn't just a murder. It was the violent conclusion of something long in motion. And the closer they got to understanding that final argument, the more it became clear. The real story didn't start that night. It started years earlier. with a family built on success, and slowly torn apart by everything that came with it. Because what investigators would uncover next would shift suspicion, fracture loyalties, and expose a truth no one was ready to face. And once that truth surfaced, there would be no protecting anyone anymore. If there's one thing Hollywood teaches you, it's that appearances are everything. Lights, cameras, red carpets, they hide a lot. Behind the glitter, the designer gowns, and the perfectly framed smiles, there's often a mess most people will never see. And for Rob and Michelle, that lesson had been lived daily. On the surface, they were a power couple. Iconic, successful, charismatic in ways that made their presence felt the instant they walked into a room. People envied them, admired them, wanted to be near them. But power has a cost, and the higher the pedestal, the longer the fall. What the cameras never captured were the moments between the flashes, the whispered arguments in hallways, the tension at family dinners, the tiny fissures that, over time, became cracks too wide to ignore. According to sources who requested anonymity, the couple's public image was meticulously curated. Every interview, every appearance, every photo was calculated. And yet, the strain behind the scenes had been escalating for years. It started small. A disagreement about finances. A misunderstanding about career decisions. But with families like theirs, small things never stay small. They accumulate, layer upon layer, until eventually, the weight of all of it can crush even the strongest bonds. Friends described the couple's dynamic as intense but private. Their arguments were rarely public, but when they happened, they left scars. Emotional ones, yes, but also practical consequences, broken trusts, resentments, and secrets carefully tucked away. Then came Nick. As an adult, he was brilliant, ambitious, talented, but he carried the weight of legacy on his shoulders. Every decision he made was scrutinized, every mistake magnified, and the family's scrutiny was relentless. Even at that party, witnesses noted subtle tensions. It wasn't overt. It wasn't something that would catch a casual observer's eye, but there were shifts in body language, sidelong glances, pauses that carried meaning. And, most tellingly, a charged energy whenever Nick and his parents were in the same room. By the time the evening was in full swing, it was clear to anyone paying attention that something had already started. The argument that would become central to the investigation had roots stretching back years. Sources later told detectives that unresolved conflicts and unspoken grievances had been simmering silently, like a pot left on the stove too long. And the holiday party, meant to be cheerful and festive, acted as the spark. Small disagreements at the party escalated rapidly. A joke misinterpreted, a comment taken as an insult. Then voices raised, eyes locked, and for those brief moments, the masks of civility fell away, revealing something darker. It wasn't only about one night. It was about decades of unresolved tension that had been quietly shaping the family dynamic. After the party, the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it intensified. According to reconstructed timelines, Rob and Michelle left early, seeking to avoid further conflict. But Nick's mood, friends say, was unsettled. He moved with purpose, leaving the impression that he had more to say and more to confront once the party ended. Meanwhile, back at home, the couple prepared for what they thought would be a quiet evening, a chance to reflect, unwind, and leave the stress of the world outside. They had no idea the conversation that would erupt behind closed doors would be their last. Investigators later pieced together the timeline. Phone records, witness accounts, and subtle inconsistencies all pointed to a pattern. Text messages left unanswered, calls made but ignored. The kind of silence that is deafening when you know something is wrong. And there's a human element in all of this that can't be ignored. The psychology of anger and frustration within families. When grievances are ignored, resentment builds. It mutates. Small slights turn into perceived betrayals, and perceived betrayals into explosive confrontations. The final night wasn't a random act of violence. It was the culmination of years of friction, a perfect storm of emotion and opportunity. And the party, which seemed innocuous at the time, had been the catalyst. But here's the twist most people won't realize. The explosive confrontation wasn't just about immediate grievances. It was also about identity, pride, and the weight of expectation. Nick, as witnesses described, felt trapped. Loved, yes, but confined by the shadows of success cast by his parents. His every move was measured against theirs, and the pressure created a simmering frustration few could understand. Rob and Michelle, meanwhile, were not oblivious. They were aware of the tension. They had tried to guide, to mediate, to control, and sometimes, unknowingly, to dominate. The dynamics of authority and rebellion were at play, ancient and powerful. By the time the argument escalated after the party, no one had truly anticipated the consequences. What began as a heated discussion turned into a chain of events no one could stop, and the rest of the evening would become the foundation for a tragedy that would shock not only the family, but everyone who thought they knew them. And yet, the first signs of trouble were subtle, almost invisible. Neighbors heard nothing unusual. Security cameras outside recorded only fleeting shadows. It's a chilling reminder that the most dangerous moments often happen in silence, away from the eyes of the world. So, as investigators would later note, the clues left behind were psychological as much as physical. They were in glances, in gestures, in the way family members positioned themselves in a room. The story of that night isn't just told by evidence. It's told by behavior, by the invisible threads connecting the people in that house, threads that would ultimately snap with devastating consequences. The night ended not with a single dramatic incident captured in footage or by witnesses, but in an invisible, lethal crescendo. And as the morning approached, what had begun as a disagreement had spiraled into something irreversible. Because sometimes, the cracks beneath the glamour aren't just cracks, they're fault lines. And when pressure builds, those fault lines can open without warning, consuming everything above them. And in the case of this family, the house, the party, and the silence of the night would all bear witness to the first steps of a tragedy no one saw coming. Families are complicated. That much we all know. But some families carry layers so intricate, so entangled, that even those inside them sometimes struggle to see where one person ends and another begins. In this story, those layers were more than just emotional. They were a blueprint for the events that would unfold on that fateful night. Rob and Michelle's marriage had always been visible, but few truly understood what lay beneath the polished exterior. They were partners in life, yes, but also in legacy. Every decision, every career move, every social appearance was carefully coordinated. Friends described them as almost symbiotic. Two halves of a machine that needed perfect synchronization to function. But as with any machine, if one part falters, the consequences ripple outward. Enter Nick. He was their son, their heir to both fortune and influence. On the surface, he had every advantage. Education, opportunity, connections. Everything a young man could want. But the reality was more complicated. In families like this, advantages are often invisible chains. Every achievement is measured against parental expectation. Every mistake magnified by legacy. The burden of being born into prominence is heavy, and not everyone bears it gracefully. According to sources close to the family, Nick had always been a volatile presence. Charismatic when he wanted to be, brilliant in conversation, yet prone to sharp moods and sudden outbursts. His relationship with his parents was described as passionate but strained, a dynamic filled with love, resentment, and unspoken tensions that had accumulated over decades. The family's private life was tightly controlled. Outsiders rarely witnessed real conflicts. Arguments were whispered behind closed doors or masked by laughter in public. Yet beneath the surface, there were battles over money, over legacy, over autonomy. These were the kind of fights that fester silently until they erupt with violence that surprises everyone. And that's exactly what happened that night. Hours before tragedy, the simmering tension manifested subtly. Observers at the party noticed small moments of friction, sidelong glances, curt responses, brief pauses that carried a weight far beyond ordinary conversation. Nothing overt, nothing alarming enough to intervene, but enough that, in hindsight, the signs were unmistakable. The couple left the party early, reportedly to avoid further confrontation. But the argument didn't end with their departure. Sources later indicated that once back home, unresolved issues resurfaced quickly. Voices rose. Old grievances were aired. What might have been a routine family dispute escalated into a volatile confrontation that neither party could control. Nick's role in the evening's events is central. Investigators reconstructed his movements using phone records, security footage, and witness statements. He arrived separately, pacing and agitated, engaging in terse conversations that hinted at anger and frustration. Experts who reviewed the behavior suggested he was operating under a combination of stress, perceived betrayal, and a need to assert himself, classic triggers in volatile family dynamics. The argument itself, according to sources, touched on multiple layers: authority, independence, unspoken resentments, and the pressure of legacy. It wasn't a single issue but a cascade of conflicts that collided in an explosive crescendo. And as the night unfolded, those who were later interviewed described a shift from tension to outright hostility, though thankfully, no one outside the family witnessed the full escalation. For Rob and Michelle, the challenge was balancing control and compassion. They had spent decades guiding, advising, and sometimes dictating, believing their experience and perspective were invaluable. But that same approach can feel oppressive to a child navigating adulthood, even one raised in privilege. Nick's perspective, as pieced together from sources and behavioral experts, suggests he felt constrained, scrutinized, and misunderstood. He may have perceived his parents' guidance not as support, but as a constant reminder that he was never enough, never independent, never free to define his own path. The interplay of expectation and rebellion is a classic narrative in any family, but in this case, it was intensified by the spotlight of fame, wealth, and influence. The pressure cooker of generational expectation can turn a small spark into a wildfire, and that night, it was clear that emotional thresholds had been breached. As the evening progressed, investigators believe the argument shifted between private discussions and heated confrontations. The couple attempted to de-escalate, to maintain calm, but the weight of accumulated resentment was too heavy. By the early hours, what began as disagreement had become something far more dangerous. A collision of emotion, history, and opportunity. This is where patterns in family dynamics become crucial. Experts often note that families with deep, unresolved conflicts are prone to sudden, intense eruptions. Control and defiance interplay in ways that outsiders rarely perceive. And tragically, those closest to each other are often most at risk when tensions explode. Rob and Michelle's story is a stark reminder of that phenomenon. Their devotion to legacy, combined with decades of carefully managed appearances, created an environment in which hidden fractures could not heal. The holiday party was not the cause. It was merely the catalyst that brought long-simmering issues to the surface. And here's the chilling part. Once those cracks were exposed, there was no turning back. What had been hidden behind charm, wealth, and success now dictated the events that would follow. The day ended with silence outside the house and a calm that masked the storm within. But behind closed doors, forces long in motion were reaching their inevitable conclusion. Every gesture, every word, every unresolved argument played a part in the tragedy that had yet to be fully understood. As investigators continued to trace the web of family dynamics, it became apparent that the story was more than a single night. It was decades in the making. And the question that haunted everyone involved was simple yet terrifying. How did love, legacy, and expectation combine to produce a night no one would survive unscathed? The answers, when they began to emerge, would shatter perceptions, expose secrets, and reveal the dangerous power of unresolved conflict in a family where every move is magnified by privilege and influence. The problem with parties is that they are supposed to be harmless. Music, laughter, food, the clink of glasses. A celebration of life, success, and the people who matter most, or at least, the people who are invited. But sometimes, parties are the perfect stage for something far more sinister. For Rob, Michelle, and Nick, that night started as a typical holiday gathering hosted by one of Hollywood's most charismatic figures. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances mingled in rooms bathed in soft golden light, unaware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Everything looked perfect. From the outside, it was effortless glamour, a snapshot of lives most people could only dream of. Inside, however, the atmosphere was subtly different. Guests later recalled moments that, in hindsight, were impossible to ignore. Rob laughed. Yes, but there were pauses, micro-expressions that hinted at unease. Michelle smiled politely, but her attention kept darting to her son, Nick, who moved through the crowd like a storm contained in a glass. His charm was evident, but there was an edge, an intensity that made even seasoned observers pause. At one point, a lifelong friend tried to diffuse tension with a light-hearted comment, but the exchange didn't land. Eyes narrowed, voices slightly raised. The subtle friction that had been building over years was now visible, like cracks in a veneer. Some guests assumed it was nothing. Families argue. Tensions flare. No one thought to question it further. And that was the mistake. Because small cracks in a facade, when ignored, often predict much larger fractures. According to sources close to the family, Nick's mood was noticeably different that evening. He had been drinking more than usual, pacing occasionally near the edges of the room, and engaging in conversations that seemed charged with meaning only he understood. His parents noticed, of course, they always did, but outwardly, they tried to maintain control, to project calm, to avoid embarrassment. The couple had attended countless events like this before. They knew how to navigate appearances. They knew how to smile while silently negotiating disagreements. But this night was different. The tension followed them like a shadow as the evening progressed. And then came the first significant flare-up. It happened near the bar, according to witnesses. A discussion over trivial matters, who had forgotten a mutual friend's birthday, who had taken credit for a minor success, spiraled into something more heated. Words became sharper, gestures more pronounced. It wasn't shouting yet, but it was enough to make people pause. The subtle warning signs, the stiffening of shoulders, the slight narrowing of eyes, the controlled exhale that always precedes anger, were all there. But no one knew what they were witnessing at the time. It appeared, on the surface, to be ordinary family friction. By the end of the evening, Rob and Michelle made a calculated decision. They left early, not because they were defeated, not because they had lost, but because they understood that staying longer might escalate tensions beyond control. They didn't know how prescient that decision would prove to be. Once home, the dynamic shifted dramatically. The moment the door closed behind them, the structured calm of the party evaporated. Behind closed doors, years of unresolved conflict, subtle resentments, and unspoken grievances resurfaced with intensity. Nick, who had been pacing and simmering at the party, continued to grapple with emotions that had been suppressed for years. Experts suggest that long-term suppression of anger in familial relationships, especially in families with high expectations and intense scrutiny, can lead to explosive confrontations. This is exactly what happened. Phone records later indicated multiple attempts at communication that were ignored or unanswered. Texts, calls, and messages created a digital map of frustration and avoidance. The silence amplified tension, and as investigators reconstructed the night, a chilling realization emerged: the conflict wasn't spontaneous. It had been incubating for years. The argument, when it escalated, was not just about the events of the night. It was about legacy, power, and identity. Nick felt constrained by expectations he never asked for, while Rob and Michelle felt responsibility to guide and control a family that had grown beyond their immediate influence. Friends would later describe the moment as a perfect storm, the confluence of stress, history, and proximity that makes tragedy almost inevitable. And it was inevitable. By the early hours of Sunday morning, what began as subtle tension had become a confrontation so intense that it would leave lasting scars. But the full extent of what happened that night wouldn't be revealed until investigators pieced together the physical and psychological evidence. Guests at the party had no idea that this gathering, seemingly ordinary and festive, was the final chapter in a story that had been building for decades. No one could have imagined that laughter and clinking glasses would precede a tragedy that would shock the family, the city, and eventually, the world. As authorities would later note, the party was more than just a social gathering. It was a mirror of the family's hidden dynamics, a catalyst that exposed vulnerabilities, and a prelude to the events that would unfold in the quiet of their home. Because sometimes, the most dangerous moments occur not in public conflict, but in private silences, where unresolved anger and unspoken resentments collide. And what came after that night would prove just how deadly those collisions could be. The drive home should have been ordinary. Streetlights streaking across the windshield. The soft hum of tires on asphalt. Familiar roads winding through quiet neighborhoods. For most people, that moment is mundane, even calming. For Rob, Michelle, and Nick, it would become the prelude to a night none would forget or survive. The couple had left the party early, intent on avoiding further tension. They were calm, or at least as calm as two people who knew an argument was simmering could be. Rob focused on the road. Michelle, sitting beside him, appeared tense, her fingers drumming lightly on the leather seat. Silence filled the car, thick and heavy, the kind that only exists when unspoken thoughts crowd every space. Nick followed behind them in a separate car, though observers later reconstructed the timing as unusually tight. He had left the party later, walking past the remaining guests with an intensity that didn't escape anyone paying attention. He didn't wave. He didn't joke. His exit was sharp, purposeful, and calculated. As the vehicles made their way up the hills, there were moments of normalcy. The radio played in the background. Michelle attempted light conversation. Rob responded politely, his mind likely juggling both driving and the brewing tension. But under the surface, every mile added weight. Nick's car pulled into view at the driveway shortly after his parents arrived. The timing was critical. According to witness reconstructions and traffic logs, he lingered near the entrance, pacing briefly before entering the home. Observers couldn't have known, but this timing would later factor heavily into investigators' theories. Inside, the home was quiet, unusually so for a house that often thrummed with life and activity. The couple had hoped for calm. They wanted distance from the night's unresolved issues. But quiet is a fragile thing when tension has been accumulating for decades. Experts reviewing the timeline later emphasized that domestic confrontations rarely escalate instantaneously. They unfold in stages, a trigger, a buildup, and finally, a breaking point. In this case, the trigger may have been the residual anger from the party. The buildup occurred during the short drive, and by the time the front door closed, the breaking point had arrived. Michelle reportedly asked a simple question as they entered the house. "What are we doing here, really?" Rob didn't respond immediately. His silence was a pause filled with more meaning than words could convey. In families like theirs, pauses are often louder than arguments. They signal hesitation, fear, or suppressed frustration. Nick appeared moments later. Witnesses outside would later describe him as composed, yet there was an intensity in his movement. His body language suggested a man prepared to confront long-suppressed grievances. What happened next cannot be described with certainty. There were no cameras inside, no outside witness. The evidence had to be reconstructed painstakingly, piece by piece. Phone records, physical evidence, and witness testimony from friends familiar with the family's dynamic. Investigators pieced together a sequence that paints a chilling picture. Arguments escalated quickly. Voices rose. Words became weapons. Past hurts were dredged up. Each phrase cut deeper than the last. Years of unspoken resentment were now expressed in raw, immediate confrontation. One source later described the scene as a powder keg in slow motion. The family's history, expectations, and interpersonal tensions were all combustible material, waiting for a spark. That spark had already struck during the party. Now, it was time for the inevitable explosion. The house, a symbol of success and stability, became the stage for conflict. Rooms that once held laughter and celebration were now arenas of anger, where words alone were insufficient to contain emotion. Each gesture, each look, carried weight. Each movement could escalate or defuse the situation, and the wrong move had consequences none of them could have anticipated. Meanwhile, the outside world remained oblivious. Neighbors continued their routines. Streetlights flickered. The city hummed below. And yet, inside that home, every second counted. Every moment was a step closer to the tragedy that would soon define the family forever. Investigators later noted the silence in the immediate aftermath of the argument. It was a silence not of peace, but of consequence, a silence that marked the final moments before life as they knew it ended. The drive home had been uneventful in the conventional sense. No honking horns, no road rage, nothing to suggest disaster. Yet in retrospect, It was the critical transition from the controlled tension of the party to the uncontrolled chaos of private conflict. And once the door closed, the scene inside would confirm what no one outside could see. When unresolved conflict meets proximity and opportunity, the results can be catastrophic. The drive home was the final line between a night of potential and the night of irreversible tragedy. What followed that moment would unfold quickly, irreversibly, and in ways that would shock the family, the investigators, and everyone connected to them. When silence falls after a heated argument, it can be deceiving. It feels calm, safe, temporary, the kind of pause that allows people to breathe, regroup, and maybe even forget what just happened. But sometimes, silence isn't a lull. It's the prelude to something far darker. For Rob, Michelle, and Nick, that silence descended the moment the front door closed behind them. Outside, the world continued. Cars passed, neighbors moved about their routines, and the city hummed obliviously. Inside, however, every heartbeat, every breath, carried the weight of unresolved tension. The couple had arrived home safely from the party. They believed the worst of the evening's tension was behind them. They were wrong. The residual emotions from the party lingered in every corner, seeping into every movement, every glance, every word exchanged. Nick entered the home sometime after his parents. The exact timing remains debated, but records suggest he did so with purpose. Behavioral experts later noted that deliberate pacing and entry can indicate premeditation, or at the very least, a mind fixated on confrontation. The family's home, usually a haven of routine, was now charged with energy. Every room contained decades of interactions, laughter, discipline, pride, resentment. The walls themselves bore silent witness to patterns of behavior that had escalated over years. According to sources familiar with the reconstruction, the argument reignited almost immediately upon Nick's arrival. Words that had been exchanged lightly at the party were now sharpened by proximity, by history, and by emotion. Accusations flew. Defensive postures were assumed. Attempts at de-escalation were made but failed. Investigators emphasized that domestic confrontations often follow predictable stages: an initial trigger, a build-up of emotion, and a breaking point. What makes them dangerous is the familiarity between participants. The closer the relationship, the deeper the potential for emotional harm. In this case, the family's intimate knowledge of each other amplified every insult, every perceived slight, every point of tension. Michelle reportedly attempted to mediate, trying to calm the rising storm. Rob, on the other hand, tried to assert control, maintain authority, and deflect escalation. But when long-standing resentment collides with immediate frustration, authority can be perceived as oppression and mediation as bias. Investigators later noted subtle but telling signs in the physical evidence. Objects slightly moved from their usual places, furniture shifted, evidence of a struggle, but not in the chaotic manner of an unplanned attack. These indicators suggested that the events were rapid, emotionally charged, but contained within a familiar space. An environment that both gave opportunity and constrained movement. The timeline reconstructed from digital records shows that phone calls were made and ignored, messages sent but left unanswered, a pattern of communication, or lack thereof, that paints a picture of emotional isolation. It is a reminder that in families with high conflict, silence can escalate tension as effectively as any argument. Witnesses familiar with the family reported that, in the hours before the tragic climax, there were brief pauses, moments when each person likely assessed the situation, considering options, weighing reactions. These pauses, while seemingly innocuous, are critical in behavioral analysis. They represent the mind at work, processing stress, emotion, and potential outcomes. As the night moved closer to dawn, the confrontation intensified. What began as verbal disagreement transitioned into a series of actions that, while not fully observed, left traces that would become central to investigators' understanding of the events. The sequence of the final hours is important because it highlights a fundamental truth. Most domestic tragedies are not sudden, chaotic bursts of violence. They are escalations over time, influenced by history, environment, and psychology. Understanding the timeline allows investigators, and ultimately, the public, to see that what appears spontaneous is often the culmination of unseen processes stretching over decades. By the early morning, the tension had reached a point where reversal was unlikely. Every interaction carried heightened emotional weight. Every decision, no matter how small, could have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. And then came the silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of aftermath, the kind that can shock anyone who enters too late. It would be Romy, the daughter, who first breached that silence. Her arrival, hours later, would shatter the fragile boundary between private tragedy and public awareness. The final hours of that night, when traced carefully, reveal a chilling pattern. Familiar space, familiar people, history-laden relationships, all converging in a moment that no one could stop. And when Romy opened the door that morning, she would confront not just the consequences of hours, but the culmination of decades of unresolved tension. The timeline shows that tragedy rarely happens instantly. It builds, layer by layer, second by second, decision by decision. And in families where power, expectation, and emotion collide, the results can be catastrophic. Morning arrived quietly, deceptively. The streets were calm. Birds chirped. The first light of day cast a soft glow over the neighborhood, masking the storm that had raged behind closed doors. To anyone outside, it was a typical Sunday. But inside the family home, everything had changed. Romy, their daughter, had planned a casual visit. She expected breakfast conversations, gentle laughter, perhaps a hint of light-hearted scolding from her father or soft smiles from her mother. What she found instead would shatter not only her day, but the foundation of her understanding of her family. She arrived at the house, key in hand. Earlier attempts to call her parents had gone unanswered. She assumed they were asleep or occupied. But there was a nagging unease she couldn't shake, a small, irrational sense that something was wrong. When the door opened, she was met with silence. Too complete, too unnatural. Her footsteps echoed unervingly in the hallway. She called out softly at first, then louder, her voice rising in concern. "Mom? Dad?" No response. As she moved further into the home, the faint traces of chaos became apparent. Objects were slightly displaced, not enough to suggest a break-in, but enough to indicate disturbance. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself bore witness to what had transpired. And then she saw them. The scene is difficult to describe, and investigators later noted that even those trained to confront trauma struggled with the immediate visual impact. What had been a home filled with decades of memories had transformed into a silent tableau of violence. The reality was undeniable, irrevocable, and horrifying. Her scream pierced the morning stillness. It was the first outward sign of the tragedy. Within minutes, authorities were alerted. Police cars, flashing lights, and forensic teams descended, turning the quiet neighborhood into a controlled crime scene. The investigation began immediately. Autopsies confirmed multiple sharp force injuries. The deaths were ruled a homicide. But as detectives combed through the evidence, they realized the case was more complicated than a simple act of violence. Every clue, every detail, suggested familiarity. Someone had known the victims intimately. Someone who could navigate the home without forcing entry. Someone who could approach without hesitation. Friends and family were questioned. Neighbors were interviewed. Digital records were scrutinized. Every piece of evidence was weighed, cross-referenced, and analyzed. Investigators pieced together a timeline that aligned with the last known sightings at the holiday party, the drive home, and the final hours inside the house. What emerged was a disturbing pattern. The argument at the party, long-standing family tensions, and the specific movements of those involved all converged into a chain of events that no one had anticipated, and yet, in retrospect, seemed inevitable. The human element of the discovery was equally significant. Romy's trauma, the reactions of friends, the shock in the neighborhood, it all underscored a critical reality. Violence within families leaves scars far beyond the immediate victims. It ripples outward, touching everyone connected. Investigators emphasize that domestic homicides often involve complex psychological and relational dynamics. This case was no exception. The interactions leading up to the incident, the escalation patterns, and the hidden resentments all provided context that, while not excusing the violence, helped explain how tragedy could unfold in what seemed like an ordinary household. The discovery marked the transition from private suffering to public investigation. The home became a crime scene. Conversations that were once private now became central to media coverage. Speculation flourished. And amidst the chaos, the truth, layered, complex, and emotionally fraught, began to surface. As the day unfolded, investigators, friends, and family members realized that this was not simply a crime to be solved. It was a story about relationships, pressure, legacy, and the fragile line between conflict and catastrophe. And Romy's discovery would forever change how everyone understood the family dynamic, the events of that night, and the hidden forces that can turn familiarity into fatal vulnerability. Because once discovery occurs, there is no turning back. The secrets, the tensions, and the unresolved conflicts are laid bare, leaving only the task of understanding. And the haunting question of what could have been prevented, the word autopsy carries a clinical coldness. It reduces human lives to charts, numbers, and observations. Yet within that cold, methodical process lies the truth of what happened, sometimes more telling than witness testimony or physical evidence alone. For Rob and Michelle, the autopsy would reveal more than the immediate cause of death. It would expose details that no one outside the family could have imagined, details that would shock even seasoned investigators. Official findings confirmed what had already been suspected: multiple sharp force injuries. Each wound meticulously documented, cataloged, and analyzed. The language of the report is deliberate, precise, unemotional, almost antiseptic, but its implications are devastating. It describes the injuries with clinical clarity. Deep lacerations consistent with deliberate actions, wounds that suggest proximity, and a methodical sequence rather than random chaos. What stands out in the autopsy, investigators noted, is the pattern of the injuries. They weren't defensive cuts from a panic struggle. There were no hesitation marks. The precision suggested familiarity, someone who knew the victims intimately, someone who didn't flinch, someone who executed the act with frightening decisiveness. Beyond the physical evidence, the autopsy also revealed a timeline of sorts. Medical examiners estimated the approximate time of death, aligning it with other reconstructed data: the argument at the holiday party, the drive home, and the confrontations inside the house. The sequence paints a chilling picture, from heated discussion to fatal resolution, compressed into the early hours of Sunday morning. Experts consulted by the investigation noted that the nature of the injuries often indicates not only intent but also emotion. Violence in domestic settings can be impulsive, driven by anger, or methodical, fueled by calculated resentment. In this case, the combination of precision and proximity suggested a deeply personal dimension, an act that was both intentional and emotionally charged. The autopsy also examined factors that might have contributed to vulnerability: positioning, access, and environment. Each element confirmed a critical reality: the perpetrator, whoever it was, had intimate knowledge of the home, the victim's routines, and the dynamics within the household. This reinforced earlier investigative conclusions: the danger came from within. Perhaps most disturbing were the implications for the family's broader dynamic. For decades, Rob and Michelle had managed appearances, projecting unity and control. But the autopsy's findings suggested that beneath that carefully curated exterior lay vulnerabilities that no amount of social polish could protect. The medical report also sparked renewed media speculation. Headlines focused on the shocking details and methodical nature of the crime, while armchair analysts debated motive, opportunity, and the hidden fractures within the family. Yet the report, while factual, only deepened the mystery. It confirmed death, but it did not explain why it happened or how long-standing family tensions escalated into lethal action. Investigators emphasized that the autopsy alone cannot tell the whole story. It provides facts, not motives; evidence, not emotion. And yet, combined with witness accounts, digital footprints, and behavioral analysis, it becomes a cornerstone in reconstructing the narrative. Within the family, the report reverberated like a shockwave. The knowledge of how precise and personal the injuries were made the loss all the more incomprehensible. Grief intertwined with horror, creating a complex emotional landscape that would take years to navigate if it could ever be fully understood. For the public, the autopsy confirmed the brutality of the night, but for those who knew the family, it confirmed something far deeper: the consequences of unresolved conflict, proximity to violence, and intimate betrayal. It also posed questions no one wanted to answer. Who had the knowledge, the access, and the emotional intensity to carry out such an act? How had a family known for unity and influence reached a point where violence within the household became inevitable? And perhaps most hauntingly, could it have been prevented? The autopsy was not just a medical document. It was a mirror reflecting decades of tension, history, and human emotion, all converging in a single night. Its findings would guide investigators, inform experts, and haunt the family for years to come. The moment Romy's scream shattered the quiet of that Sunday morning, the private tragedy became a public crisis. Police arrived within minutes, sirens slicing through the stillness of the neighborhood, lights flashing against the carefully manicured lawns. The scene that greeted them was horrifying, familiar in its domestic setting, yet terrifying in its implications. Investigators quickly realized that this was not a simple homicide. The precision of the injuries, the lack of forced entry, and the apparent absence of robbery pointed to someone inside the family circle. A crime this personal demanded a painstaking approach, one that left no stone unturned. The first step was securing the scene. Forensic teams moved methodically through the house, photographing every angle, collecting trace evidence, and mapping the environment. Even minor details: shifted furniture, fingerprints on surfaces, the trajectory of objects, were cataloged. Each piece contributed to reconstructing the events of that night, providing investigators with clues about timing, sequence, and possible participants. Digital evidence quickly became a focal point. Phone records, text messages, social media interactions, and email logs were scrutinized to trace movements, interactions, and emotional states leading up to the incident. Investigators noted an unusually high volume of communication attempts between the family members during the hours preceding the tragedy, some unanswered, some abruptly ended, which provided insight into the psychological buildup of the conflict. Witness interviews formed another critical layer. Friends who had attended the holiday party were questioned in detail. Subtle tensions, once invisible to outsiders, were now revealed in hindsight. Observations about body language, tone of voice, pacing, and interactions became pivotal. Investigators discovered that Nick had displayed signs of agitation and intense focus during the party, suggesting that the argument, which would later prove fatal, may have been incubating even before they left. Behavioral experts were consulted to analyze familial patterns. In high-conflict households, experts explained certain behaviors, withdrawal, pacing, avoidance, or controlled aggression, can be predictive of escalation. In this case, the evidence suggested a classic progression: long-standing grievances, emotionally charged confrontation, and proximity, creating the perfect conditions for tragedy. Forensic analysis also focused on the physical environment. The house, usually a safe haven, had become a confined stage where tension amplified. Investigators examined entry points, room layouts, and sightlines. The precision of the injuries indicated that the perpetrator moved with familiarity, knowing exactly where and how to act without interference or hesitation. Media outlets, sensing the gravity and shock of the event, began covering the story immediately. Public speculation grew rampant. Headlines highlighted the shocking nature of the crime, the prominence of the family, and the chilling efficiency of the attack. The investigation became not only a legal matter but a cultural spectacle, where every piece of evidence was dissected by both experts and armchair analysts. Within the family, the investigation forced hidden dynamics into the open. Long-simmering tensions, previously masked by appearances and polite conversation, were now exposed. Allegiances were questioned, motives were speculated upon, and the psychological weight of the investigation added pressure to an already shattered household. Law enforcement emphasized patience and precision. In cases like this, jumping to conclusions can destroy critical evidence. Investigators moved carefully, triangulating witness statements with forensic findings, digital records, and expert insights. Every inconsistency, no matter how minor, was examined. Each led to new lines of questioning and further reconstruction of the events of that night. And as the investigation unfolded, one chilling fact became increasingly clear. The tragedy was not the result of random chaos. It was the inevitable culmination of a series of escalating conflicts, proximity, and the pressures of family dynamics. Every detail, from the holiday party to the drive home, the hours of tense silence, and the emotional storm, contributed to the outcome. The investigation would take months, if not years, to fully untangle. But even in the early stages, one truth was undeniable. This was not merely a crime scene. It was a psychological puzzle, a human drama, and a cautionary tale about the deadly potential of unresolved family conflict. And as investigators pieced together the narrative, the world watched, horrified and fascinated, as the intimate story behind the headlines slowly emerged.